Hello and welcome to part 2 of this Altura Now special, all about stress, the immune system, and how eating well can help keep stress under control. I'm speaking with Delia McCabe, author of Feed Your Brain, 7 Steps to a Lighter, Brighter You. Delia, we've spoken about the effects of stress on the body and the immune system, particularly during these uncertain times, and we've discussed tips for relaxation and mindfulness. And to get through these times, I suppose we need to concentrate on long-term sustainable things that will help maintain physical and mental wellness. How can exercise help?
Well, there are a number of benefits that exercise provide, and one of them I've mentioned already. It uses up adrenaline, which is a great thing to do because your body's actually doing what it was meant to do when that adrenaline is being produced. The other thing that exercising does, which is directly related to the immune system, it allows lymph to move through our body as a surveillance technique or a surveillance cell to pick up pathogens and pick up viruses. And lymph does that when we move within plasma and blood. So that's a second reason to engage in exercise. The third reason is that when we exercise, we also increase endorphin release. That's endogenous endorphin release from within our body. And those endorphins improve our mood and allow us to just be more positive. In fact, there's a school of thought that thinks that a mood disorder is related to a lack of movement. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. The fourth thing that exercise does, it releases something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. And BDNF is a very, very powerful compound. We think of it as fertilizer for neurons because it allows certain parts of your brain, specifically the hippocampus, which is where neurons can regenerate, where neurons we can actually grow new neurons. It allows new neurons to grow in those areas, and in other areas of the brain where we can't grow new neurons, it allows them to regenerate. So BDNF is an extremely important compound for overall brain health. It also is related to modulating mood. So exercise will help in that way as well. So there are a number of important things that exercise does, and to be able to continue exercising at this point in time is extremely important for our mental health.
Can you expand on how exercise and movement benefits the lymphatic system?
We have lymph glands in lots of different parts of our body, and the only way to stimulate those lymph glands is through movement. If we don't have enough movement, those lymph glands become stagnant, and the lymph that should be moving through our body as surveillance cells can't move as effectively. And those surveillance cells, lymphocytes, are extremely important because they're there to pick up, as you said, any kind of toxins that are in the body. They pick up on cancer cells in the body, and they pick up on viruses and other pathogens. So making sure that those lymph glands work optimally and that the lymphocytes are moving through blood and plasma is very important. So they are an integral part of our immune system. And they're generated in bone marrow, but they move to our lymph glands, and that's where they operate. So having movement and exercise is great, and that's one of the things I like about yoga, because there are a lot of inverted poses in yoga, and with inverted poses your lymph gets a chance to move up and move down. And that's one of the reasons I like yoga so much, because it stimulates lymph movement.
Let's turn now to diet. How much of a role can diet play in keeping us mentally and physically healthy, especially during stressful times?
Well, I'd like to answer this in a couple of sentences, but as you know, I've written 2 books about this topic, so I won't be able to answer it really quickly. The first thing to keep in mind, and as I mentioned earlier, is that the brain is the greediest organ we have because it's our primary survival organ. And if we just think about the sentence, thinking occurs across a vast network of super sophisticated cells, chemicals, membranes, and molecules, all of which depend on nutrients. So our diet directly impacts our brain, which can use up to 50% of the carbohydrates that we consume. A fifth of the heart's output goes to fuel the brain. Every 4th breath we take, that is 25% of the oxygen that we breathe, fuels our brain. And our brain is only between 2 and 3% of our body weight. So it's a very, very greedy organ. When the brain is stressed, it uses more nutrients. It simply has no choice. It's using those nutrients to organize its functioning, which is shifting now. And it's using those nutrients to make sure that adrenaline is produced. So when we are using the same kind of nutrients to synthesize adrenaline and cortisol, if our diet isn't really good, we don't have enough nutrients to then produce serotonin and melatonin and all the other neurotransmitters we need to function optimally. So this is where people will find anybody that has experienced a really stressful time in their life, and I always use the example of packing up your house and moving. When people do that, after a couple of days, they will find that they actually can't think straight anymore. They'll just be exhausted and they'll be thinking, okay, where should that box go? I don't actually care. I'm just going to shove it in the garage. That's the kind of example that I give. What's actually happening is that the brain's run out of energy. It can no longer produce energy because it's had so many decisions to make. And we call this decision fatigue. And over a period of time with a lack of nutrients, it doesn't just manifest mentally or psychologically with a lack of energy to make decisions, and so it also will manifest physically. You'll just be exhausted, you'll feel tired all the time. And this is what a lot of people may be experiencing right now. They just feel physically fatigued, and it's because their brain, it first dibs on nutrients. The body will get it second. The brain is the primary survival organ. It has to get first choice. So that is something for people to keep in mind. So I suggest that nobody brings any junk food into their house. At this point in time, you should really be nourishing your brain with the best possible food you can find and prepare, because your brain really needs good food to be able to produce everything that it's producing and to keep your body healthy. It's people say to me, oh, well, I don't want to be deprived now. I'm feeling really stressed already.
I know, I really want ice cream.
There is healthy ice cream, and you can actually make healthy ice cream. And when you put your mind to it, you can make the most delicious, decadent chocolate ice cream and enjoy it every day if you want to, after lunch a little bit. And I make a chocolate treat. I just take very dark chocolate, I melt it. I then add all sorts of yummy things to that, slivers of coconut, maybe goji berries, dried blueberries, a variety, almonds, walnuts, and then I set it in the fridge, and then I break it up into chunks, and it forms like a crackle, and it's delicious. So we don't have to deprive ourselves, which is why I wrote my second book, because I didn't want people to feel they've got to deprive themselves while they're feeding their most hungry organ.
Today the world is commercialised, and we're bombarded with messages about this vitamin will do this and that mineral will do that, and superfoods packaged into a pill. It's easy to reach for vitamins on the shelf as a panacea, but a lot can be achieved with a simple, healthy diet, can't it?
Well, that's an interesting point, because I think that the research on the benefits of nutrients consumed, through dietary supplements is still very sparse. There isn't enough to prove that consuming nutrients is better than consuming real food. And that's for a number of different reasons related to research costs and the ability to control many different variables when people consume dietary supplements. The thing that's important to keep in mind is that, nature's evolved for millions of years, and the food that we've consumed is the kind of food that has kept us around for as long as we've been around. It contains compounds we're still busy discovering at this point. So trying to replace good food with a nutrient will always fall short of what the food is capable of producing and supplying to the body. So I would never recommend people, use a dietary supplement instead of food and skimp on their food and just think they can take something off the shelf. It's never, ever going to be as effective, ever. It's just not possible.
And of course, real food versus food-like substances or processed food is a real issue in today's world, isn't it? I mean, we're time poor and we're stressed, and it's easy to go and reach for processed foods. But we really should be reaching for whole foods, shouldn't we?
Absolutely. Whole foods are what we evolved to consume, and whole foods contain all the nutrients and all the compounds and all the fiber that we need to function optimally. The problem with processed foods is that processed foods are manufactured to make sure that the manufacturer makes money and can keep that product on the shelf for as long as possible without it going off. To be able to ensure that, he has to add a whole lot of things to that product, such as additives to keep it tasting decent, such as preservatives, damaged fats, so that the fats don't go rancid, and so on and so on. So processed food may be very simple to pick up and consume, but over the long term, the body really cannot sustain optimal health, and neither can the brain with that kind of food. It's too nutrient deficient. And when people say there's nothing like a bad food, I suggest they read food labels more carefully, because there's some compounds that people consume, chew, swallow, that actually shouldn't be called food. I think when you understand the sophistication of the body and the brain, you realize that food is really the number one way for you to quickly improve your health. Because what do we do every day? We eat 3, maybe 4 times a day. And at every one of those occasions, we have the opportunity to improve our health. So we can actually turn things around in a very short amount of time by making sure that our diet is as nutrient dense as possible.
And that's an interesting point. Just how quickly can your health turn around when you apply a healthy diet?
Good question. Once again, there's not enough research to support any definitive date. However, anecdotal evidence says that people can start feeling better after 72 hours. And blood markers can also improve, for example, with blood glucose within that period of time. However, I think the hardest thing for people to do is to give up on a habit. And you know, the myth about 21 days to a new habit is unfortunately just that. It takes between 60 days and 65 days to form a new habit. And you've got to be pretty robust with that. But once again, if you're not depriving yourself and you've replaced the foods that aren't great for you with foods that still taste great, you then stand a much better chance of sticking to the habit and finding the benefit within the shortest amount of time.
So let's talk about what's in a good diet as part of a good lifestyle. What are the main things we need to consider?
One of the most important and overlooked things is to make sure that the fats that you consume are the right kinds of fats. And why is this the fact about fats? Because fats are extremely important in functioning both mentally and physically. Just as an example, if we took all of our cell membranes and laid them down flat, they would cover more than 10 football fields. So fat is extremely important. It forms a very large percentage of those cell membranes, and 60% of the dry weight of the brain is made up of fat. The other thing about fat that very few people realize is that flavor molecules disperse more efficiently in fat than they do in water, which is why eating food with no fat generally tastes bland. And one of the reasons that the low-fat diet failed, because what they had to do with low-fat foods is pump them full of additives and flavor enhancers because it had no fat in it. So that's something that very few people understand. When the cell membrane is deprived of the right kinds of fat, it cannot communicate with its neighbor, the next cell. It also cannot, then collectively, those cells can't communicate with the entire tissue and the organ and all the systems in the body. So it all boils down to the cell membrane when we think about fats and oils. One way to damage fats and oils is to heat them, expose them to light, and of course, things like frying with fat. Really, really bad news. So taking great care of the fats that we consume is the first and cornerstone of optimal health and well-being, not just physically, but primarily mentally as well.
Even animal fat?
Well, animal fat, we could go into a long discussion about this. The lecture that I give on fats and oils actually takes 3.5 hours, so it's a long discussion. You know, animal fat, if people want to consume animal fats, they just need to do a lot of exercise because the body uses animal fat for exercise. In a long, complicated way, I'm saying that. The other thing to keep in mind is that you also need to have enough essential fatty acids if you consume a lot of saturated fat, because if you don't, that means the cell membrane will mostly be made of saturated fat, which responds differently to essential fats within a cell membrane and makes the cell membrane less malleable and less flexible. So that's something else to keep in mind. And of course, saturated fat, from animals, it needs to come from clean animals because pesticides accumulate in fat. So if you're consuming products that do not come from organic animal sources and grass-fed sources, it means that those products could be full of pesticides. So that's something to keep in mind.
Food in the modern world is a minefield, isn't it?
That is absolutely the truth. It is the truth, Steve. The challenge is for people to move through all the myths and just find the truth. And one of the things to do is to just eat as close to nature as possible. And if you're going to eat animal products, they need to be very, very clean animal products. And the most long-lived and healthy populations on the planet do not make animal products their primary food source.
Right.
Plant-based diet is definitely more supportive of long-term health. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't consume animal products because there are certain nutrients that you can only find in animal products. So that's not my message. My message is if you're going to eat animal products, make sure they are as clean as possible. but most of your diet should be made up of plants.
So eat real food, mostly from plants, and probably in the Western world, less of it, because we do have big diets.
We
Big
do,
helpings.
and when you look at populations, sorry Steve, when you look at populations that have followed a very traditional diet for a very long time, for thousands of years, you'll find that they're generally smaller and none of them are overweight. So these are people that have learned to work with nature, to consume what the environment has provided and to maximize that and to live long and healthy lives.
So if we remember these things, to have a diet that's high in soluble and insoluble fibre, that our foods are nutrient dense, they are rich in antioxidants, rich in anti-inflammatories, and B vitamins as well. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, that was a long question, Steve. Well, firstly, plant-based foods contain antioxidants naturally. And so if you want to look at the best ones, they're the most colorful ones, and they contain antioxidants. Antioxidants are actually the plant's means of protecting itself from pests and bugs. So if you have organic produce, it's better because they had to build up more antioxidants because they had to defend themselves more effectively because they had no help from us, just as an aside. Second thing to keep in mind, the foods that we choose to eat that are high in antioxidants and high in soluble and insoluble fiber lead to a reduction in the inflammatory response in the body naturally, because those kinds of foods support optimal health, which means that inflammatory responses are less likely. The other thing, there are some foods that we know are really high in inflammatory compounds, and one of them is curcumin, which is found in turmeric, that bright yellow color spice, which you find in curry powder. It's a very potent anti-inflammatory, but consuming it with the right kinds of fat increases its bioavailability, so that's important. As far as the B vitamins go, they're critical for energy production within our cells. They're important because they're involved in processes that help neurotransmitters be synthesized. They're important because they are involved in hormone production. So a high intake of B vitamins from our food is extremely important for a number of different reasons. But we naturally get enough of them when we're eating a diet that's very heavy in terms of plants.
When you talk about the right kind of fats making nutrients more bioavailable, can you explain a little more about that?
Well, bioavailability basically means that the way the nutrient is absorbed by the body is more effective. So, and I'll give you the example of curcumin. When the research was done on curcumin, and they noted that the certain groups of people had low rates of Alzheimer's consuming curcumin, they left out the fact that those curries were made using fat. So they then had to look at it and say, okay, well, just taking curcumin on its own isn't the solution. Consuming it with fat helps it be absorbed more efficiently and used more efficiently by the human body. And the same is the fact with all of the foods that we consume, because we aren't what we eat, we are what we absorb. And of course, this brings us to a discussion of the gut. If your gut is functioning optimally, if you've got enough of the good bacteria and very little of the bad bacteria, some of which we need in minute quantities, then that means that the breakdown of the food that you're consuming will be optimal and the absorption will be optimal. And that is, of course, the goal of all of us, to be able to maximize the amount of nutrients that we are absorbing from the food that we're consuming. Unfortunately, when we're stressed, our digestive function also gets impaired, because when you're very stressed and running away from the tiger, your digestive system stops, your reproductive system stops. Now we're running from that tiger on an ongoing basis. So those systems are obviously impacted negatively. So making sure that we've got a lot of soluble and insoluble fiber, as you mentioned earlier, is extremely important. And making sure that we're eating foods that are prebiotic in nature. That means those foods that we consume actually feed the good bacteria and help them proliferate. That obviously influences absorption, and that will influence bioavailability of the nutrient that we're consuming. The right fats and oils, once again, essential fatty acids, that's omega-6 and omega-3. We need them to be able to perform vast quantity of functions within our body and within our brain. In fact, between 20 and 25% of that 60% that I mentioned earlier needs to be made up of essential fatty acids for brain function to be optimal. And we don't get enough of those essential fats in our diet anymore because of food manufacturing. because it is very hard to keep those fats from going rancid because of their sophistication. So making sure that people get enough of that is extremely important. So it all works together, Steve. You know, you're asking me one question and I'm answering a number of them because we can't separate these things into silos. They're all beautifully, intricately linked.
And what happens in the gut when it receives processed foods?
Okay, let's step back a moment and just talk about the structure of the gut. The gut is a most amazing organ because it's got a very thin layer of cells between it and the bloodstream where the nutrients have to be moved to be able to supply us with what we need to live. Those cells are very sensitive to whatever is going on in the gut. So when you eat a lot of processed food, those cells actually become inflamed. And when they become inflamed, they become less capable of maintaining their structure, which needs to be very specific to be able to keep pathogens and toxins in, because remember, a huge part of our immune system resides in our gut. And that also needs to be able to allow the food, the nutrients to sift through them and to find their way into the bloodstream. So when the digestive system becomes compromised, it's actually those cells that are compromised, and the increased inflammation stops them from a structural functional point of view from being able to do their job. So what happens is they start letting out compounds that we shouldn't have in our bloodstream. And this is when people have allergic reactions and the body says, hold on a second, we don't recognize that. And then it forms an immune response against food, a food compound or a toxin that has entered the bloodstream that shouldn't have. Also, when the structure and function of those, the gut system is compromised, what happens is the nutrients don't get across properly, and they're also not digested optimally. So you're having a number of different mechanisms occurring at the same time when processed food is consumed and good food isn't consumed. But it's actually at the structural cellular level where that damage is occurring. And to be able to heal the gut is very important, to be able to get that structure and that integrity intact again so that it can do its job properly. So keeping our gut healthy and well maintained is a very big part of keeping our immune system functioning optimally.
And is it true that gut health is linked to mood and the production of serotonin?
Absolutely. We know that something below 80% of our serotonin is actually produced within our gut, and a different kind of serotonin is produced in the brain. So it's extremely important to keep our gut functioning optimally, which impacts serotonin production and synthesis, and obviously the way serotonin is used in our body. So that's very critically important. The other thing to keep in mind, which is not really related to serotonin, but there's certain bacteria in the gut. When people eat a very highly processed diet, highly food processed diet, what happens is that those bacteria proliferate, and they are very good at extracting calories, which means that even if you don't eat a lot, what will happen is that those bacteria become so good at extracting the calories that you can actually even end up putting on weight. So we want to minimize the capacity for those bacteria to proliferate, because we don't want to be extracting every last tiny calorie from every single thing we eat. A lot of the food that we eat should be fiber food that does other functions within the gut. So yes, diet definitely impacts mood because of serotonin production, but it also impacts weight and weight gain and weight maintenance.
And what about artificial sweeteners? Should we be concerned about those?
Oh, look, artificial sweeteners are really no good. And there's a lot of research to show that they don't help with weight loss, and they actually over time mess with our metabolism. So they're not even accomplishing what they're supposed to do. The other thing about artificial sweeteners, some of them have been shown to actually cause neurological damage in animal studies. And there have been a lot of anecdotal evidence to show that people that consume artificial sweeteners over a period of time end up with neurological problems. The other problem with artificial sweeteners, which is more like a psychological issue, is that it doesn't take away the desire for sweetness, which is what we're trying to dampen, because that overwhelming sweet tooth is what drives people to consume foods that are highly sweet and that we don't actually need. And so those are some of the reasons that artificial sweeteners are no good for us. My primary concern is that it's affecting people from a neurological perspective, and that they can't break a bad habit if they continue consuming artificial sweeteners. So generally use a natural form of sweetener something like coconut nectar or rice syrup or a little bit of maple syrup, rather than natural form, and slowly wean yourself of even needing that, because our brain does not need that huge hit of artificial sweetness.
So, what's your best advice for people during times of high stress?
I think the best advice, two things really. I can't really give one thing. I think the first thing is to take control over what you can. We're really living in a time where most people feel a lack of control. So being able to do that even on a small scale within your home, with your family, and with your team is important, because that will give the brain something to focus on, and it will give the brain a sense of completion when you come to the end of the day, just the things that you can focus on. And the second thing, well, I suppose it's one of the first things, it forms part of the first answer, is take control of the food that you eat. Don't bring junk into your home. Make sure that you make food from scratch. Try recipes you haven't tried before. Try to make your food as delicious as possible, but as nutritious as possible. Because when we get out of this, we don't want to have the negative effects that can happen if we just throw caution to the wind and eat everything that we feel like eating. Our immune system will thank us for that, and so will our mental and our physical health. So I think there are a number of different factors to take into account through this challenging time. But we do have more control than we're giving ourselves credit for, maybe. And we need to just understand that we're part of a very resilient species. And we have managed to find ourselves out of some pretty bad pickles before. And I think we need to trust ourselves. We need to be kind to ourselves, and we need to still be firm with ourselves and do the things that we know are right for our overall health and well-being.
Great advice. Delia has written 2 books. Feed Your Brain, 7 Steps to a Lighter, Brighter You. It's the ultimate guide to getting your brain in tip-top condition simply via the foods you eat. It includes healthy and delicious recipes. Delia's second book, Feed Your Brain, the cookbook, adds more great recipe ideas. Both books are available online. You can order through Amazon and Apple Books. To find out more about the work that Delia is doing, go to lighterbrighteryou.life and also follow her on LinkedIn. Delia, thanks so much for sharing your insights. We'd love to have you on again.
It was a delight, Steve. Thank you so much.
And please subscribe to Altura Learning's YouTube channel and follow us on social media. And remember, we are resilient. We'll get through this stressful time if we stay kind to ourselves and, of course, to each other. Please keep up to date with government information and keep safe. I'm Steve Iloff. Join us next time on Altura Now.